In the vast expanse of the Andromeda Coalition, where 1,000 alien civilizations had thrived for millennia, there existed an unshakable truth. Some problems simply had no solutions. The void plague that consumed entire star systems, the quantum storms that tore through hyperspace lanes, the ancient sentinels that guarded forbidden technologies. These were facts of existence, immutable laws of a universe that had humbled even the most advanced species. Then came the humans. They arrived with ships held together by what their enemies called primitive welding, and their allies termed creative engineering. They brought no ancient wisdom, no evolved psychic abilities, no technology that bent reality itself. What they carried instead was something far more dangerous, an absolute refusal to accept that anything was impossible. When the greatest minds of the galaxy declared a situation hopeless, humans had a peculiar habit of rolling up their sleeves, cracking their knuckles, and saying 4 words that would echo across the cosmos. "We've got this." And somehow, inexplicably, impossibly, they always did. The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been called at the ungodly hour of 0300 Standard Time, rousing diplomats, scientists, and military commanders from across 17 sectors. Ambassador Zephyr 9, a crystalline being whose species had mastered interstellar travel when Earth was still a molten rock, floated above her designated platform as holographic displays painted the assembled delegates in shifting blues and reds. The images were horrifying. Entire solar systems reduced to expanding clouds of superheated gas. Ships, massive dreadnoughts that had survived centuries of warfare, simply ceasing to exist as reality itself seemed to unravel around them. The Nexus breach, as the scientists had dubbed it, was consuming everything in its path with the methodical precision of a cosmic lawnmower. "The situation is clear," announced High Counselor Thrakis, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence as he gestured toward the display. "The Nexus breach has expanded beyond all our predictions. It has consumed the Helix Nebula, the Crimson Worlds, and is now approaching the heavily populated Kepler cluster. 17 billion souls hang in the balance." A murmur of distress rippled through the chamber. The Kepler cluster wasn't just another collection of worlds. It was home to some of the galaxy's most ancient civilizations, repositories of knowledge that stretched back millions of years. Dr. Vexhai, the Coalition's leading theoretical physicist, materialized as a shimmering hologram at the center of the chamber. Her serpentine form coiled nervously as she began her presentation. "We have exhausted every conventional approach. Gravitational manipulation, quantum field disruption, temporal displacement. Nothing affects the breach. It appears to exist partially outside our dimensional framework, making it immune to any technology we possess." "What about the Arcadian nullifiers?" asked General Karath, his massive frame bristling with the cybernetic enhancements that had made his species the galaxy's premier warriors. "Useless," Vexhai replied, her voice carrying a note of defeat that chilled the assembled delegates. "We deployed 3 of them directly into the breach's path. They simply disappeared. No explosion, no energy release, no debris. They ceased to exist as if they had never been." The chamber fell silent. The Arcadian nullifiers were weapons of last resort, capable of destabilizing space-time itself. If they had no effect, how long? Ambassador Zephyr 9's question rang with crystalline clarity. Vexai's form flickered as she consulted her data. At current expansion rate, the breach will reach the outer worlds of the Kepler cluster in 72 hours. Complete consumption of the cluster will occur within 144 hours. The silence stretched until High Counselor Thrakis cleared his throat, a sound like gravel grinding against metal. "Then we must begin immediate evacuation protocols. We cannot save the worlds, but perhaps we can save some of the people. 17 billion beings." General Karatha's voice was grim. "Even with every transport vessel in the Coalition, we might evacuate 10%. Maybe 15 if we abandon all cargo space and pack them in like livestock. Then, that is what we must do," Thrakis said, though the defeat in his voice was unmistakable. "Alert all available ships. Begin evacuation immediately." And he paused, his ancient features creasing with reluctance. "Send a priority message to Earth. The humans should be informed that one of their newer colonies, New Brisbane, lies within the projected path." As the session dissolved into urgent planning for the largest evacuation in galactic history, a new signal appeared on the communication arrays. The source signature was immediately recognizable, a human vessel broadcasting on all frequencies. "Galactic Council, this is Captain Sarah Chun aboard the UES Tenacious Optimism. We've been monitoring your emergency channels and have reviewed your data on the Nexus breach. We're requesting permission to dock at Nexus Station and offer our assistance." The communication officer, Junior Valhari with nervous tendrils twitching around his communication implants, looked up at High Counselor Thrakis. "Sir, shall I inform them that evacuation ships are being coordinated through Sector Command?" Thrakis studied the ship's identification signature. The Tenacious Optimism was listed as a heavy cargo freighter, converted for scientific research. Its crew complement was listed as 7 humans, which meant it could evacuate perhaps a few hundred refugees at most. "Tell them," Thrakis began, then stopped. There was something about humans that had always puzzled him. They had joined the Coalition barely 50 years ago, a remarkably short time by galactic standards, yet they had somehow involved themselves in every major crisis since. Not because they were asked to, but because they simply showed up. "Tell them they have permission to dock, but emphasize that this is an evacuation operation. We appreciate their offer, but there's nothing they can do that our best scientists haven't already attempted." The message was transmitted, and for several minutes, there was no response. Then, Captain Chen's voice crackled through the speakers again, and there was something in her tone that made several delegates pause their urgent conversations. "Understood, Council. We got this." 12 hours later, the Tenacious Optimism docked at Nexus Station, the Coalition's largest research facility, positioned at what was considered a safe distance from the approaching breach. The station buzzed with activity as ships arrived to take on refugees, and researchers packed decades of irreplaceable data into transportable storage units. Captain Sarah Chun was not what most aliens expected from a human ship commander. She was compact, barely reaching the chest height of an average Valhari, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and wearing a jumpsuit that had clearly seen better decades. What struck most observers, however, were her eyes, alert, calculating, and carrying the peculiar gleam that humans got when they were about to do something that others considered impossible. She was accompanied by her crew, Dr. Marcus Webb, a quantum physicist whose theories were considered brilliant, but largely theoretical by Coalition standards. Engineer Rodriguez, whose specialty seemed to be making broken things work through methods that violated several laws of physics. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a xenoarchaeologist who had spent more time in ancient alien ruins than any human alive. Pilot Jackson Jazz Morrison, whose reputation for flying ships through impossible situations was becoming legendary. Communications specialist Lu Wei, who could apparently make any piece of technology talk to any other piece of technology, and, finally, Dr. Elena Vasquez, whose expertise in exotic matter made her one of the leading authorities on phenomena that officially didn't exist. High Counselor Thrakis met them in the station's main docking bay, flanked by Dr. Vexhai and a security detail that seemed unsure whether the humans were guests, consultants, or potential interference. "Captain Chun," Thrakis began, his translator struggling with human naming conventions. "While we appreciate your offer of assistance, I must emphasize the gravity of our situation. This is not a problem that can be solved through." He paused, searching for a diplomatic way to phrase it. "Creative improvisation." Sarah smiled, and Thrakis felt a peculiar chill. He had seen that expression before, on the faces of humans who were about to accomplish something that every expert had declared impossible. "High Counselor, I understand your concern, but my team has been studying the data you've made public, and we think we might have a different perspective on the problem. Dr. Vexhai slithered forward, her form rippling with barely contained skepticism. Captain, with all due respect, this phenomenon has been analyzed by the greatest minds in the galaxy. The Nexus breach operates on principles that we barely comprehend, let alone control. That's exactly the problem, Dr. Webb interjected, pulling out a handheld device that projected a three-dimensional model of the breach. You try and understand it first, then solve it. Sometimes you have to work backwards. Meaning, Thrakis asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Dr. Tanaka stepped forward, her eyes bright with excitement. We've been studying the archaeological data from systems the breach has consumed. There are patterns, specific types of stellar formations, particular quantum signatures in the local space-time. This isn't random cosmic phenomena. This is artificial. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Vexhai's form went completely still, a sign of extreme agitation among her species. Artificial, she whispered. You're suggesting this was created? Not just created, Dr. Vasquez added, consulting her own readings. Controlled. The expansion isn't chaotic, it's following a programmed pattern, which means it can be reprogrammed. General Korath stepped forward, his cybernetic implants whirring softly. Even if that's true, the power source would have to be enormous, beyond anything in our understanding. Engineer Rodriguez grinned, and several of the aliens took an unconscious step backward. Rodriguez's grins were usually followed by explosions, though to be fair, they were generally explosions that solved problems. That's where you're thinking too big, he said. What if the power source isn't enormous? What if it's just efficient? Captain Chun held up her hand before the questions could begin. High Counselor, we'd like permission to take the tenacious optimism on a scouting mission to the breach perimeter. We need to collect some specific readings. Absolutely not, Dr. Vexhai hissed. The gravitational distortions alone would tear your ship apart before you got within a light hour of the phenomenon. Not if we don't try to fight them, Pilot Morrison said casually. Sometimes the trick isn't avoiding the storm. It's learning to surf it. Thrakis looked at the humans, then at his advisors, then back at the humans. In 50 years of dealing with this species, he had learned one immutable fact. When humans said they had a plan, the universe had a disturbing tendency to bend around their will. How long, he asked. 18 hours, Captain Chen replied. If we're right, we'll have a solution. If we're wrong, she shrugged, well, you'll still have 54 hours for evacuation. Against every instinct screaming in his head, against the advice of every expert in the room, High Counselor Thrakis found himself saying, permission granted, as the humans filed out of the docking bay, chattering excitedly among themselves about quantum resonance frequencies and dimensional anchor points. Dr. Vexhai slithered up to Thrakis. You realize they're probably going to get themselves killed, she said quietly. Thrakis watched through the viewport as the tenacious optimism undocked and turned toward the approaching doom that had already consumed dozens of worlds. Yes, he admitted, but if anyone in this galaxy can stare at the impossible and convince it to become possible, it's them. The human ship disappeared into the darkness, heading directly toward a phenomenon that had humbled the greatest civilizations in galactic history. On Nexus Station, evacuation continued at a frantic pace, but for the first time since the crisis began, there was something else in the air. It was small, fragile, and probably foolish. It was hope. And, as every alien who had dealt with humans could attest, hope was the most dangerous thing humans carried. Because when humans had hope, they stopped accepting limitations. They stopped believing in impossible. And the universe, for reasons no one fully understood, had a habit of agreeing with them. The tenacious optimism approached the Nexus breach with the casual confidence of a tourist heading to a vacation destination, rather than a small cargo ship flying directly toward a phenomenon that had devoured entire civilizations. On the bridge, Captain Chin watched the sensor readings with the same expression she might use to review a grocery list. Jazz, how are we looking on the gravitational gradients? She asked, settling into her command chair with practiced ease. Pilot Morrison's hands danced across his controls with fluid precision. Like riding a waterfall in a canoe, Captain. Terrifying, but manageable, assuming you don't mind the occasional laws of physics trying to turn you inside out. Dr. Webb looked up from his instruments, excitement radiating from every movement. The quantum signatures are even stranger than the data suggested. It's like reality is being edited. Whole sections of space-time are being rewritten in real time. Rewritten by what? Engineer Rodriguez asked from his position at the system's monitor, where he was apparently making the ship's engines do things that would make their manufacturers weep. That's the million-credit question, Dr. Tanaka replied. Her eyes fixed on the archaeological sensor array she had jury-rigged to the ship's main scanner. But I'm detecting traces of construction materials that match some very old ruins I've studied. We're talking about technology that predates the current galactic civilization by millions of years. Dr. Vasquez glanced up from her exotic matter readings. The energy patterns are consistent with dimensional manipulation technology. But the scale, she shook her head in amazement. It's like using a stellar engine to power a flashlight. Or, Dr. Webb said slowly, like using a flashlight to power a stellar engine. What if the actual mechanism is incredibly small, but it's leveraging some kind of cosmic amplification effect? On the main screen, the Nexus breach loomed before them like a wound in reality itself. Space simply stopped at its edges, replaced by a swirling void that seemed to drink in light and matter with equal hunger. Ships that had attempted to study the phenomenon were visible as expanding clouds of debris, and even those were being consumed as they watched. Lou, any luck with communication attempts? Captain Chen asked. Communications specialist Lu Wei looked up from her console, frustration evident on her features. I've tried everything. Radio, laser, quantum entanglement, even some of the more exotic alien communication methods. Either there's nothing there to communicate with, or it's operating on frequencies we can't even detect. Or, Rodriguez suggested with a grin, it's using a communication method that's so advanced it looks like background noise to our equipment. That's actually not a bad theory, Dr. Webb mused. If this is ancient technology, it might be using communication protocols that we've never encountered. The ship shuddered slightly as they passed through another gravitational wave, and several alarms began chirping before Rodriguez silenced them with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to ignore everything that wasn't actually going to kill them immediately. Approaching optimal scanning range, Morrison announced. Though I should mention that optimal is relative when you're studying something that treats physics like a suggestion. Dr. Tanaka suddenly straightened, her eyes widening as she stared at her readings. Wait, stop, full stop. Jazz, hold us exactly where we are. Morrison's hands flew over his controls, bringing the ship to a relative halt that required constant adjustment as space-time itself seemed to shift around them. What is it? Captain Chun asked, moving to look over Tanaka's shoulder at the archaeological sensors. I know this pattern, Tanaka said, her voice barely above a whisper. The energy signatures, the dimensional distortions, the way matter is being consumed and converted. I've seen this before. Where? Dr. Vasquez demanded, abandoning her station to join the growing crowd around Tanaka's console. Kepler, 442b, the dead world in the outer rim. I spent 6 months studying the ruins there, trying to figure out what had destroyed such an advanced civilization. Tanaka's fingers flew over her controls, calling up archive data from her previous expeditions. They called themselves the Architects. Their technology was based on quantum archaeology, the ability to reach back through time and manipulate past events. Dr. Webb's face went pale. Temporal manipulation on this scale would require enormous amounts of exotic matter. The kind of amounts that would create a cascade effect, Dr. Vasquez finished. They weren't trying to consume the galaxy. They were trying to fix something in their past, and the process got out of control. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. So we're looking at a runaway temporal engine that's been chewing through space-time for millions of years. More than that, Tanaka said, pulling up holographic displays of the architect ruins. Based on the archaeological evidence, I think they succeeded in whatever they were trying to do. The Nexus breach isn't malfunctioning. It's continuing to operate exactly as designed. The problem is that its mission parameters are no longer relevant. Captain Chun studied the data, her mind working through the implications. So we're dealing with an ancient machine that's still running a program from millions of years ago, and it doesn't know when to stop. Exactly. And the longer it runs, the more energy it consumes from the quantum vacuum, and the more space-time it needs to process. Dr. Webb was already running calculations on his handheld device. At its current expansion rate, it will consume this entire galactic arm within 10,000 years. But it can be stopped? Captain Shin asked. Dr. Tanaka nodded slowly. In theory, the architects built shutdown protocols into all their major installations. But accessing them requires understanding their quantum archaeological interfaces, and, more importantly, it requires someone to actually reach the control center. Which would be where exactly? Rodriguez asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. At the heart of the Nexus breach, Tanaka replied. Probably in a pocket dimension that's partially outside normal space-time, which is why it's been invisible to conventional scans. Morrison looked up from his piloting console with a grin that would have made a sane person run screaming. So we need to fly into a phenomenon that dissolves matter at the quantum level, navigate through folded space-time to find a pocket dimension that may or may not exist, and somehow convince a machine that's been running for millions of years to finally take a coffee break. That's about the size of it, Captain Chun confirmed. Cool. When do we leave? Dr. Vasquez held up a hand. Wait, even if we can find this control center, operating architect technology requires specific quantum signatures. You can't just walk up to their machines and start pressing buttons. Dr. Tanaka smiled, and for the first time since they had approached the breach, she looked truly confident. Actually, you can. The architects designed their technology to be operated by any sufficiently advanced intelligence. They believed that if a species was smart enough to find their installations, they were smart enough to use them responsibly. Bit of an oversight there, Rodriguez commented. Their civilization ended before they could update their access protocols, Tanaka agreed. But it means that we can interface with their systems, assuming we can reach them. Captain Shin looked around at her crew. All right, people, we've got a plan that's probably insane, definitely dangerous, and requires us to do things that no one has ever done before. Anyone want to back out now? The response was immediate and unanimous. 6 hands raised in the air, not to indicate surrender, but to volunteer for different aspects of what would undoubtedly be the most dangerous mission in human history. Lou, start working on communication protocols that might interface with architect technology. Use everything we know about their quantum archaeological principles. Dr. Vasquez, I need you to figure out how to shield us from dimensional distortions. Webb, work with Tanaka on navigation. We need to find a path through folded space-time to a destination we can't detect. Rodriguez, I need you to modify our engines to handle gravitational stresses that should crush us into component atoms. Jazz, you get the easy job. You just have to fly us through a cosmic blender that's designed to unmake reality. What about you, Captain? Morrison asked. Sarah Chun settled into her command chair and began reviewing the tactical displays. I'm going to figure out how to explain to the Galactic Council that the only way to save 17 billion lives is to fly a human cargo ship into the one place in the universe that everyone agrees is completely inescapable. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. Lu Wei worked her communication magic, developing interface protocols based on quantum archaeological theory and a healthy dose of educated guessing. Dr. Vasquez turned their cargo hold into an exotic matter laboratory, synthesizing materials that existed mostly in theoretical physics textbooks. Dr. Webb and Dr. Tanaka hunched over navigation computers, plotting a course through space that folded back on itself like an origami sculpture designed by a madman. Rodriguez performed what he cheerfully called aggressive modifications to their engine systems, installing components that he freely admitted were held together by hope and electromagnetic tape. Morrison ran endless flight simulations, preparing for maneuvers that had never been attempted by anything larger than a subatomic particle. And, throughout it all, Captain Chun maintained a constant communication link with Nexus Station, updating High Counselor Thrakis on their progress, while carefully not mentioning some of the more terrifying aspects of their plan. Captain Chun, Thrakis' voice crackled through the speakers. Our evacuation efforts are proceeding, but slowly. Even with every available transport, we will be able to evacuate perhaps 20% of the Kepler cluster population before the breach arrives. I must ask, do you have any concrete results to report? Sarah looked around at her crew. Rodriguez was elbow-deep in an engine modification that was making their fusion reactor run on principles that would give physicists nightmares. Dr. Webb was calculating navigation routes through dimensions that might not actually exist. Dr. Tanaka was attempting to decode control interfaces for a civilization that had been extinct for millions of years. We're making progress. High Counselor, we should have something definitive for you within the next 12 hours. Captain, I must be frank with you. The Galactic Council is considering more drastic measures. There are suggestions that we should attempt to use quantum demolition charges to disrupt the breach's expansion. That would be a very bad idea. Dr. Vasquez called out from her exotic matter laboratory. Quantum explosions in an already destabilized dimensional framework could cascade across multiple realities. You wouldn't just destroy this galaxy. You could damage the fundamental structure of space-time itself. There was a long pause before Thrakis replied. Dr. Vasquez, you realize you have just described a scenario that our best physicists consider impossible. Rodriguez looked up from his engine modifications, grinning. High Counselor, you really need to stop using that word around humans. We take it as a personal challenge. We've got this, High Counselor, Captain Chin said firmly. Just give us a little more time. After ending the communication, Dr. Webb looked up from his calculations. Sarah, I have to ask, are you absolutely certain about this? Because the math I'm running here suggests that our chances of survival are irrelevant. Captain Chun interrupted. Marcus, the chances of 17 billion people surviving if we don't try are zero. The chances of them surviving if we do try are greater than zero. Sometimes that's the only math that matters. Dr. Tanaka activated the main display, showing their projected course into the Nexus breach. It looked like a three-dimensional maze designed by someone with a grudge against geometry, threading through pocket dimensions and quantum fluctuations that defied rational description. This is it, she announced. Our path to the control center. It'll require split-second timing, navigation through 11-dimensional space, and precise modulation of our dimensional resonance to match architect protocols. Morrison studied the display with the expression of a man who had found his calling. I've flown through asteroid fields, ion storms, and that time we had to navigate through the event horizon of a black hole. But this... He paused and grinned widely. This is going to be fun. Define fun, Rodriguez muttered, though he was already running final checks on his engine modifications. The kind of fun that we'll either celebrate for the rest of our lives or regret for the 3 seconds before we cease to exist, Morrison replied cheerfully. Dr. Vasquez emerged from the cargo hold, covered in exotic matter residue and looking like she hadn't slept in days. Dimensional shielding is complete. It should protect us from the worst of the reality distortions, assuming my calculations are correct. And if they're not, Captain Chin asked, then we'll discover new and interesting ways that the human body wasn't designed to exist in 11-dimensional space. Luwei looked up from her communication console. Interface protocols are ready. I've created a translation matrix based on quantum archaeological principles. It should allow us to communicate with any architect systems we encounter. Should? Dr. Webb questioned. Marcus, we're about to fly into a cosmic phenomenon that consumes realities for breakfast. At this point, should is the most confident prediction anyone can make. Captain Chin stood and looked at each of her crew members in turn. They were tired, scared, and about to attempt something that would either save billions of lives or add their names to the growing list of casualties consumed by the Nexus breach. They were also, she realized, exactly where they wanted to be. All right, people, time to show the universe what humans do when everyone else says something is impossible. She settled into her command chair and activated the ship's intercom. All stations, prepare for entry into the Nexus breach. And remember, we've got this. As the tenacious optimism turned toward the swirling void that had defied the greatest minds in the galaxy, High Counselor Thrakis watched from Nexus Station and found himself doing something he hadn't done in over 2 centuries. He prayed. The moment the tenacious optimism crossed the event horizon of the Nexus breach, reality became optional. On the main view screen, space folded itself into patterns that hurt to look at. Stars appeared, aged billions of years and seconds, and died in explosions of impossible colors before being born again backwards through time. The ship's hull groaned as it experienced gravitational forces that pulled in directions that didn't technically exist. Well, Morrison announced with characteristic understatement, this is definitely not in the pilot's manual. His hands moved across the controls with inhuman speed, adjusting their trajectory through 11-dimensional space, while simultaneously preventing the ship from being scattered across 17 different timelines. Every few seconds, he would mutter something like, "Okay, that dimension doesn't exist anymore," or "Anyone know what happens when you take a left turn through yesterday?" Dr. Vasquez monitored the dimensional shielding from her station, watching energy readings that fluctuated between mildly concerning and physically impossible. "Shielding is holding," she reported, "though I'm detecting some concerning resonance effects in the exotic matter matrix." "Define concerning," Captain Shin requested, gripping her command chair as the ship performed a maneuver that involved traveling through next Tuesday to get to last week. "The exotic matter is beginning to evolve. It's developing properties that don't exist in our normal space-time framework. On the positive side, this is making us more compatible with the dimensional distortions. On the negative side, we might not be entirely human by the time we reach the control center. As long as we're still thinking human thoughts, I'll take it," Chen replied. Dr. Webb looked up from his navigation calculations, sweat beading on his forehead despite the ship's climate control. "The dimensional maze is more complex than we anticipated. It's not just folded space, it's layered reality. We're passing through different versions of the universe, each one slightly altered from the last." "What kind of alterations?" Dr. Tanaka asked, simultaneously trying to decode architect beacon signals and not think too hard about the fact that her archaeological sensors were detecting civilizations that wouldn't exist for another million years. "Hard to say. In one layer, physics works normally. In another, time runs backwards. In a third, matter seems to be conscious and is having philosophical discussions with energy." Webb paused as another wave of dimensional distortion passed through the ship. "I think we just passed through a reality where mathematics is considered a form of interpretive dance." Lu Wei's communication array suddenly lit up with signals from sources that didn't appear on any sensor. "I'm getting communications from everywhere. Signals from the past, future, alternate timelines, and what I think might be the ship we would have been if we'd made different design choices. Also, something that claims to be the anthropomorphic representation of entropy wants to know if we're here about the warranty on reality." "Tell entropy we're here on business," Captain Chun said calmly. "And see if you can filter for architect's signals specifically." Rodriguez looked up from his engine monitoring station, where he was somehow keeping their fusion reactor stable despite the fact that the fundamental constants of physics were changing every few minutes. "You know what the strangest part is? The engines are actually running better in here. It's like reality is more flexible, so they can work the way they want instead of being limited by boring things like conservation of energy." "That," Dr. Vasquez said slowly, "is either the most encouraging thing I've heard all day or the most terrifying." "Why not both?" Morrison called out as he piloted them through a region where cause and effect were having a disagreement. "Besides, we're almost through the maze. I can see the center on the navigation display." The center, when it appeared on their view screens, was unlike anything any of them had expected. Instead of some massive alien installation, they found themselves looking at what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary asteroid, roughly spherical, perhaps 10 kilometers in diameter. It sat in the middle of a pocket of normal space-time, surrounded by the swirling chaos of the dimensional maze like the eye of a cosmic hurricane. "That's it," Rodriguez said. "That's the control center for a machine that's been eating galaxies for millions of years." Dr. Tanaka checked her archaeological sensors, then checked them again. The quantum signatures match, but you're right, it's much smaller than expected. Although, she paused, studying the readings more carefully. The internal structure readings are interesting. It's bigger on the inside than the outside. A lot bigger. "How much bigger?" Captain Chen asked. "I'm reading internal dimensions of approximately 50,000 cubic kilometers, contained within an asteroid that should have an internal volume of maybe 500 cubic kilometers. Dimensional compression technology," Dr. Vasquez said admiringly. "The architects built their control center in a pocket universe that overlaps with normal space. Elegant solution to the real estate problem." Morrison guided them toward the asteroid, which showed no reaction to their approach. "Should we be worried that an installation powerful enough to consume solar systems doesn't seem to have any defenses?" The entire dimensional maze was the defense system, Dr. Webb pointed out. Anything that made it through to the center would have to be either extremely advanced or extremely lucky. "Which are we?" Lu Wei asked. Captain Chun considered this. "I'm going with extremely stubborn." "Lu, any response to our communication attempts?" "Nothing yet, but I'm detecting some kind of scanning beam. Something is definitely aware of our presence." As if summoned by her words, the surface of the asteroid suddenly reconfigured itself, revealing a docking bay that was unmistakably artificial. The opening was sized perfectly for their ship, which raised the interesting question of how an alien installation from millions of years ago knew the exact dimensions of a human cargo freighter. "Okay, that's not ominous at all," Rodriguez muttered. Morrison brought them in for a landing that was remarkably smooth considering they were docking with a pocket universe. As the ship settled onto the artificial surface, the docking bay sealed itself and began filling with atmosphere. "Breathable air," Dr. Vasquez reported, checking her sensors. "Standard nitrogen-oxygen mix, appropriate pressure, and temperature. Either this is the most convenient coincidence in galactic history, or something is actively making this environment suitable for us." Dr. Tanaka was already suiting up in her archaeological gear, excitement radiating from every movement. According to the historical records, architect installations automatically adapt their environment for visiting species. It's part of their universal accessibility design philosophy. "They're what now?" Morrison asked. "The architects believe that advanced technology should be usable by any intelligent species that encountered it. They designed their installations to automatically configure themselves for whatever life forms tried to use them." Captain Chun checked her sidearm, more out of habit than any belief that conventional weapons would be useful against million-year-old alien technology. "All right, people. Dr. Tanaka, you're our expert on architect tech. Dr. Webb, I need you monitoring dimensional stability. I don't want to get trapped in here if the pocket universe decides to collapse. Lu, maintain communication with the ship and with Nexus Station if possible. The rest of us will follow Tanaka's lead and try not to accidentally destroy the galaxy." "What if we accidentally save it instead?" Rodriguez asked. "Then, we'll add it to our resume," Chen replied. The airlock cycled, and they stepped into the control center of the most powerful machine ever constructed. The interior was breathtaking. The asteroid's compressed dimensions were filled with a vast installation that seemed to blend architecture with living organism. Crystalline structures pulsed with soft light, connected by flowing channels that carried streams of liquid energy. The air hummed with barely audible harmonics that seemed to resonate in their bones. "This is incredible," Dr. Tanaka breathed, her instruments detecting technology that operated on principles that wouldn't be discovered for thousands of years. The entire facility is a single quantum archaeological processor, capable of reaching back through time and manipulating historical events on a cosmic scale. They followed a pathway that seemed to configure itself for their footsteps, leading them through chambers filled with displays showing the history of galaxies they had never seen. In one chamber, they watched the rise and fall of civilizations that had existed in parallel dimensions. In another, they observed the birth of stars that would never exist in their own reality. The amount of processing power required for this. Dr. Webb trailed off, staring at computational systems that existed partially outside normal spacetime. They're running historical simulations of entire galactic clusters simultaneously. At the heart of the installation, they found a central control chamber. It was surprisingly simple, a circular room with a single interface terminal in the center, surrounded by holographic displays showing the current status of the Nexus breach operation. Dr. Tanaka approached the interface with the reverence of someone handling the most precious artifact in existence. This is it, the master control for the quantum archaeological processor. According to my readings, it's been running the same program for approximately 4.2 million years. Lu Wei opened her communication array and began interfacing with the architect systems using the protocols she had developed. Almost immediately, the chamber filled with images, sounds, and data streams that told the story of an ancient tragedy. The architects, they learned, had been the most advanced civilization in their galaxy, masters of time, space, and dimensional manipulation. But their very success had led to their downfall. In attempting to prevent a cosmic catastrophe that would have destroyed all life in their galaxy, they had made a mistake. Their intervention had saved their galaxy, but doomed another, inhabited by billions of innocent beings. The quantum archaeological processor had been their attempt to fix their mistake, to reach back through time and prevent the catastrophe without causing the secondary disaster. But the calculations required were enormous, and the process consumed vast amounts of space-time energy. What was meant to be a precisely targeted operation had become a runaway process that consumed everything in its path. They're still trying to solve the problem, Dr. Tanaka said in amazement. For over 4 million years, this machine has been calculating different historical scenarios, trying to find a solution that saves everyone. And in the process, it's been consuming entire solar systems for processing power, Dr. Webb added. It's trapped in an infinite loop. The more it consumes, the more complex the calculations become, requiring even more consumption. Dr. Vasquez studied the quantum energy flows with growing understanding. It's not malevolent. It's desperate. The architects programmed it with a prime directive to preserve life, and it's been struggling to fulfill that directive ever since. Captain Chen looked at the interface terminal, then at her team. So how do we stop it? We don't stop it, Dr. Tanaka said slowly. We help it complete its mission. She approached the interface terminal and began entering commands using the archaeological principles she had spent decades studying. The system responded immediately, as if it had been waiting millions of years for someone to understand what it was trying to accomplish. The solution is elegant, she explained as she worked. The architects were trying to solve an impossible equation, how to prevent one catastrophe without causing another. But they were thinking in terms of single timeline causality. What if instead of preventing the catastrophe, we redirect its effects? Her fingers flew across the interface, inputting calculations that drew on quantum archaeological principles and human intuition in equal measure. Instead of reaching back through time to change what happened, we reach sideways through dimensions to find realities where the catastrophe never occurred. Then, blend those realities with the damaged ones. That's... Dr. Webb started, then stopped. Actually, that might work. Instead of changing history, you're averaging multiple histories together. The catastrophic effects get diluted across multiple realities while the positive outcomes are preserved. But that would require enormous computational resources, Dr. Vasquez pointed out. Even more than what the processor has been using. Dr. Tanaka smiled. That's where human creativity comes in. We don't need more computational power. We need smarter computation. She gestured to the interface. I'm inputting optimization algorithms based on human problem-solving methods. Instead of calculating every possible outcome, we're teaching the system to recognize patterns and make educated guesses. Rodriguez looked around at the ancient installation with newfound respect. We're teaching a machine that's older than our entire civilization how to think like a human. More specifically, Lu Wei added as she monitored the system integration, we're teaching how to think like a human who refuses to accept that some problems are unsolvable. The processor responded to Tanaka's inputs with what could only be described as enthusiasm. Across the chamber, holographic displays began showing new calculations, new possibilities, new hope for the civilizations that had been lost. It's working, Dr. Webb reported, monitoring the dimensional stability readings. The processor is beginning to redirect its energy consumption patterns. Instead of consuming new space-time, it's drawing power from the dimensional intersections between realities. Captain Chen activated her communication link to the ship. Jazz, are you reading any changes in the breach structure? Morrison's voice crackled through the speakers with barely contained excitement. Captain, you're not going to believe this. The breach is contracting, not just stopping its expansion, actually shrinking. High Counselor Thrakis' voice joined the communication from Nexus Station. Captain Shun, our sensors are detecting massive dimensional distortions throughout the affected region. What is your status? We're implementing a solution, High Counselor. The breach should begin reversing its effects within the next few hours. Reversing? Captain, you cannot reverse the consumption of entire solar systems. Dr. Tanaka looked up from the interface with a grin that would have made any human proud. High Counselor, you might want to check your long-range sensors. I think you're going to be surprised. On Nexus Station, the sensor technician stared at his readings in disbelief before reporting to the High Counselor. Sir, I'm detecting massive energy signatures in the regions previously consumed by the breach. It appears that solar systems are being restored. The restoration process was unlike anything ever witnessed. Where the breach had consumed matter and energy, new stars began to shine. Planets reformed from quantum fluctuations, their histories rebuilt from the dimensional echoes that the processor had been storing for millions of years. The machine wasn't just consuming the solar systems, Dr. Tanaka explained as she monitored the process. It was storing their quantum signatures, preserving them in dimensional memory, while it calculated how to restore them. Every world, every civilization, every life that was lost, it was all being preserved, waiting for a solution. And now? Captain Chen asked. Now the processor has a solution. It's not just restoring what was lost. It's integrating the best possible outcomes from multiple realities. Worlds that were destroyed by war are being restored in peaceful versions of history. Civilizations that felt a disease are being returned with the knowledge to cure themselves. Dr. Webb monitored the quantum flows with growing amazement. The computational elegance is incredible. By averaging multiple realities, it's not just fixing the damage. It's creating better outcomes than existed before the catastrophe. Across 17 sectors, impossible things began to happen. Worlds that had been consumed by the breach rematerialized, but they were subtly improved versions of their original selves. Civilizations that had been destroyed were restored with the wisdom to avoid the mistakes that had led to their downfall. The galaxy wasn't just being repaired, it was being upgraded. On the restored world of Kepler Prime, an elderly philosopher watched the stars return to a sky that had been empty for months and whispered, they kept their promise. Dr. Vasquez watched the energy readings stabilize as the processor completed its million-year mission. The system is shutting down non-essential functions. It's transitioning to standby mode. Mission accomplished? Rodriguez asked. Dr. Tanaka nodded, her hand still resting on the interface terminal. Mission accomplished. The architect's debt has been paid. The lives they accidentally destroyed have been restored. The machine can finally rest. Captain Chun activated her communication link. Nexus Station, This is Captain Shun. The Nexus breach has been neutralized. All consumed systems are in the process of restoration. The immediate crisis is over. The silence that followed lasted so long that she began to wonder if their communication had been disrupted. Finally, High Counselor Thrakis' voice came through the speakers, heavy with emotion. Captain Shun, according to our sensors, you have just accomplished something that our greatest scientists declared impossible. You have not merely stopped a cosmic catastrophe. You have reversed it. How do we even begin to thank you? Captain Shun looked around at her crew. Dr. Webb, who had navigated them through impossible mathematics. Dr. Tanaka, who had solved the puzzle that had frustrated an ancient civilization for millions of years. Dr. Vasquez, who had kept them anchored to reality while traveling through dimensions that didn't exist. Engineer Rodriguez, who had made their ship work in conditions that should have torn it apart. Lu Wei, who had established communication with technology older than most star systems. And Pilot Morrison, who had flown them through the most dangerous place in the galaxy with the casual confidence of someone taking a scenic route. High Counselor, she said finally, you don't need to thank us. This is what humans do. What humans do. We show up when everyone else says the situation is hopeless. We refuse to accept that some problems don't have solutions. We look at the impossible and we say we've got this. As the tenacious optimism lifted off from the ancient installation, leaving the quantum archaeological processor to its well-earned rest, Captain Shun reflected on the events of the past day. They had faced down a cosmic catastrophe that had humbled the greatest civilizations in galactic history. They had navigated through dimensions that existed only in theory. They had solved a puzzle that had been consuming galaxies for millions of years. And somehow, despite all the odds, despite all the expert opinions that declared their mission impossible, they had succeeded. Because that was what humans did. They didn't accept limitations. They didn't believe in impossible. And when a universe presented them with a problem that had no solution, they found a way to create one. As news of the restoration spread throughout the galaxy, a new phrase began to circulate among the various alien civilizations. When faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges, when confronted with problems that appeared to have no solution, species across the galaxy began to say, call the humans. They'll figure it out. Because in a universe full of ancient wisdom and advanced technology, sometimes what you really needed was a small group of stubborn primates who were too polite to let 17 billion people die and too stupid to know when something was truly impossible. The Galactic Council established a new department dedicated to studying human solution methodology, though they admitted that their research primarily consisted of documenting things that shouldn't work but somehow did. Their preliminary findings suggested that humans had somehow weaponized optimism and turned stubbornness into a fundamental force of nature. But the humans themselves didn't see anything unusual in what they had accomplished. As Captain Shun often said when asked about their success, we just showed up and did the job. Because that was what humans did. And the universe, for reasons that physicists were still trying to understand, had a peculiar habit of rearranging itself to make room for their solutions. In the years that followed, when other crises threatened the galaxy, when ancient machines malfunctioned or cosmic phenomena threatened entire civilizations, the call always went out to the same small blue planet in an unremarkable spiral arm. And the humans always answered the same way. We've got this. And impossibly, inexplicably, inevitably, they always did.